Erev Shabbat Shalom Rabotai. We are continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Sheviit. We're up to Perek Bet Mishna Aleph. Today's Mishnah should be Le'ilum Nishmat Nere Ben Svelana Aran Bayim Menuchato Began Eden. Amen. In the first chapter, Rabotai, the Mishnah taught the halacha of plowing a field and in which trees were growing during the year before Shemitah. The Mishnah now is going to teach us the halachot of plowing a field where grain or legumes are going to be planted. And you should know there's a very basic difference between plowing a field of trees and plowing a field of grain and legumes. When the Mishnah was speaking about plowing a field of trees, it was speaking about plowing a field where trees were already planted. But when we say a field of grain or a field of legumes that you want to plow, you're plowing it before you planted the grains or legumes in order to prepare the soil for actual planting. So Mishnah says, until when can we plow a grain field during the year before Shemitah? Now, literally, Sdei Alavan means a white field, but we use that to refer to a grain field or a legume field because those fields are generally white because there's no trees for shade or to darken the field with their shadows. So until when can you plow a grain field during the year before Shemitah? Until the moisture dries up, until most of the wetness from the winter rain dries up. And the Mefarshim tell us that in Eretz Yisrael, the rainy season lasts throughout the winter months with the final early summer rain falling in Nisan. Once most of the moisture has dried up, you are no longer allowed to plow that field. But generally, there's a large amount of moisture left in the ground until shortly after Pesach. Now, if you remember from the first chapter, this is a much earlier deadline than when you're allowed to plow a field of trees before Shemitah, because that halacha over there said that you're allowed to plow a field of trees before Shemitah until Shavuot. Whereas here we're saying 49 days earlier, you're allowed to plow a field of grain up until Pesach, which is a difference of 49 days. Now, the difference between a field of trees and a field of grain or legume is like this. Plowing is only allowed during the year before Shemitah as long as it's beneficial for the crops of the 6th year. Now, why do you plow a field where you grew trees? It's in order to allow the water to seep down to the roots. That's good enough. That's already going to be beneficial even if there's just a small amount of water in the ground. Therefore, you're allowed to plow for a much more extended period of time, for another 49 days, because we only care as long as there's a little amount of water. But other fields, like grain fields or legumes, they're plowed before they're planted in order to prepare the soil for planting. That requires a large amount of moisture. Therefore, the deadline is much earlier. It's by Pesach. And the Mishnah tells us, this concept of until the moisture dries up, that is defined as long as people are still plowing in order to plant melon or gourd fields. Now, the Mefarshim explained to us because once the harvest season begins in Nisan, grain is not generally planted anymore, but melon and gourds are still planted as long as most of the moisture in the ground is still there. Now, since there is still a large amount of moisture in the ground, these crops of the 6th year can still be planted, the gourds and the melons. So since plowing the field prepares the soil for the crops of that year, you are allowed. But once most of the moisture dried up in the field and people no longer plant even melons and gourds, the field can no longer be plowed for that year's crop. Why? Because, well, again, once most of the moisture dries up and people don't plow for that year's crop because they can't even plant melon or gourds anymore, you are not allowed to plow the field at all because that appears like you're doing it for the purposes of the following year, which is the Shemitah year. Now, as long as there is still moisture in the ground, people who see someone plow his field are going to assume that he plans on planting gourds or melons there. That makes it allowed to plow, even if you're not planning on planting gourds or melons, but you're plowing for the benefit of the land, which can become ruined if you don't plow it. But once there's no moisture left and people will think that you're plowing to prepare the soil for Shemitah, then it's allowed to plow even if you're doing it for the sake of the land. However, another Tana is going to disagree with this. Amar Rabbi Shimon says, Natata Torat kol echad v'echad biyado, you put each individual's halacha in his own hands because now each person's going to say whatever he wants. One landowner is going to say that there's not enough moisture in his land and he's going to stop plowing, while a second landowner is going to say there is still moisture in the land. He's going to continue plowing because since every plot of land is different, people can easily make the mistake and they're going to think that their field has enough moisture and they're going to still keep plowing their land. Meanwhile, it doesn't have moisture and they're not allowed to. In the Sdei Alavan, like we said, in the grain or the legume field, you're allowed to plow only until Pesach, and in the Sdei Ilan, in the field of trees, only until Shavuot. Now, Rabotai, after these times, anyone who's plowing the field is likely doing so in order to prepare the soil for Shemitah, and that's asur. But like we mentioned earlier in chapter 1, Mishnah 4, that these halachot only applied in the time when the Beit HaMikdash was standing. Once the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, Rabban Gamliel and his Beddin, his court, they ruled that it is allowed to plow any field until the actual Shemitah begins. That is in Rabotai of Mishnah Aleph. The next 4 Mishnayot, starting with Mishnah Bet, are going to discuss which field-related activities can be done throughout the 6th year. Now, we have a general rule. Activities are mutar during the entire 6th year if either, number 1, they benefit the crops that grow during that 6th year, or number 2, they are the types of activities that during Shemitah year itself, during the 7th year, are only asur midrabanan, not deoraita. And the Mefarshim point out to us that the Torah specifically prohibits only 4 types of activities during Shemitah. In Sefer Vayikra, chapter 25, pasuk 4 and 5, planting, pruning a grapevine, which is cutting off dead branches so the vines can grow better, harvesting grain, and picking grapes. Plowing, even though it's not mentioned specifically in the Torah, that's also biblically asur, but certain other activities only asur midrabanan. So the Mishnah tells us, Mizabelin um'adirin b'mishkaot u'b'midlaot. We are allowed to scatter fertilizer and hold the soil in fields of melons and gourds. Now, the Rab explains when we say to hold the soil, that's referring to it's at the base of the trees. Now, the Mefarshim explained to us in areas that were hard to plow with the regular animal-pulled plow, like the area around trees, people would dig up the soil with a handheld tool like a hoe. Now, during the Shemitah year itself, this is a isur d'oraita like plowing. So the Mishnah tells us, ad Rosh Hashanah, you can do it until Rosh Hashanah of the 7th year. And the Mefarshim explain, melons and gourds grow even during the summer months, and therefore when you scatter fertilizer, and hold the field, it benefits the plants for that 6th year. Therefore, you're allowed to do it the entire 6th year. The Mefarshim explained to us that spreading fertilizer is allowed until Rosh Hashanah. Why? Because it's only asur midrabanan, not deoraita. Plowing and hoeing are also allowed until Rosh Hashanah because they benefit the crops of the 6th year. So even though it's asur midoraita to do that during the Shemitah year, it has the first condition of benefiting the crop during the 6th year. Now, even though the previous Mishnah taught us that you're not allowed to plow a field after a certain point in the 6th year, that applies only when you're plowing to prepare for planting. If the plants were already growing, you're allowed to plow for their benefit until Rosh Hashanah. V'chen bebet hashelachin, so too you're allowed to spread fertilizer and hoe an ingraded field, meaning one that will not grow without watering, until Rosh Hashanah of the 7th year to benefit the plants of the 6th year. And the Mefarshim explain, because it needs a lot of water, an irrigated field's crop takes longer to grow and is still growing during the summer months. Therefore, it has the same halakha as melons and gourds. You're allowed to hold the soil the entire 6th year because it's for the benefit of these late season crops. Miyabilin, we can remove wart-like growths from trees. Mefalkin, we can cut down extra leaf from trees so the tree's not going to be burdened. Me'abikin, we can spread dust over tree roots so that have become uncovered. Me'ashenin, we may cause smoke to blow around the tree in order to kill worms or insects that live there. Ad Rosh Hashanah, until Rosh Hashanah of the 7th year, because these activities are not asur midoraita on the year of Shemitah, only asur midrabanan. Therefore, you can do them all throughout the 6th year. Rabbi Shimon Omer, but Rabbi Shimon disagrees. Af notelu et ha'ala min ha'eshkol b'Sheviit. He allows something to be done even during Shemitah itself. He says, Af notelu et ha'ala min ha'eshkol b'Sheviit. You're allowed to cut off extra leaves from the cluster of fruit even on Shemitah itself. Why? Because your kavanah is only to save the tree from being damaged, not to help it grow. Now, the Chachamim allow a person, they agree that a person can do work during Shemitah if it's going to save the tree from damage, but they say that cutting off the extra leaves is asur because to a certain extent, it also not only saves it from damage, it helps the tree grow. So it's a dispute between Rabbi Shimon and Chachamim if you're allowed to do this during the Shemitah year itself. The Rav tells us the halacha is not like Rabbi Shimon. And halacha ki Rabbi Shimon, the halacha is not like Rabbi Shimon, and you are not allowed to cut the extra leaves off the cluster of the fruit on the Erev Shemitah, because even though you're saving the tree from being damaged, you are to a certain extent helping it grow as well. That is in Rabotai today's Mishna Yomi. Everybody should have a Erev Shabbat Shalom. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen v'amen.